so, what a God. Let us realize that the best sort of a religious life arises out of the mutual experiences and reflections that we have, or in fact, the best sort of religious life is this mutual experiencing and reflecting about our experiences, our relations, and reflecting about our relations, more particularly our relations with whatever is ultimate. Let's intensify our communication with each other about religion, and thus have the more mature religion. However, how shall we act towards those people in our culture who are still in the majority, who still hold this belief of their own preferential relation with God? Are we going to bring these people around to this reality that God has always and is now sharing with us, particularly through our mutual experiences and reflections? Each man is being communicated with too at his stage of development. As we teach in some classes here, God accepts us all as we are and shares with us in the promotion of our own maturation. Well, the answer, as I see it, is to go particularly out of our way to be friendly with these people, to have them feel free to express their ideas to us, to give them priority of expression. But then, as the occasion seems to warrant, it's worth to try to secure a reevaluation of this one fatal idea of preference. The thing above all else that we must do is to keep open the avenues of communication between them and us. For without communication, growth ceases, life ceases, and denial of human rights, intolerances, war, mass murder, and death begin to stalk abroad. May I stop on this keynote that it is in our intercommunication that we find the reason for living, the meaning of life. It is in this intercommunication, communication with our fellows and with whatever may be to us the absolute, but an absolute that carries no regional, cultural, or group preferences, that we find ourselves the real victory for our spirits in a world in which men obviously sojourn for a while and then pass away.
Well, Max, I think you've done a very brilliant job in analyzing the causes and giving us some areas in which the evidence of this racial and religious and also
people cannot see it. In fact, I wonder if I would mind it.
all right, a little more informal the other way, but I think that's a very good suggestion, Chairman. Max, I believe, as I said, that you have outlined very brilliantly some of the causes and some of the areas in which we find evidence concerning these things. I'd like to ask you a couple questions, perhaps on some of these various points that you've listed. You have indicated, or you made mention of the fact that the more mature religion is our mutual experience and reflecting about our relations with one another. That to me seems to indicate that religion then is a relationship of man and man. It has been my previous understanding that religion was a relationship between man and God. Are you proposing a new definition of religion?
Well, my answer, of course, is that the religious experience is a complex factor involving a configuration, an involvement of many factors, such as your notion of whatever God is, or the absolute, your fellow man. It isn't a question of whether there is a God, it's a question of what kind of God you have that's involved in your experiences that makes the difference. It's not a question of either or, it's a question of an involvement of all factors entering into one's life. That's my answer to it.
I would like to pursue that further, but we have only 4 minutes for questions here, and I want to ask a couple other points. You speak about the fatal idea of preference. How much is the concept of preference or preferential treatment a part of the personal concept of ego? How much is my own concept of my own status built upon the fact that perhaps just one thing in this world I may do a little bit better than my neighbor? If we break down this fatal concept of preference, how much damage do we do to the human personality?
In my judgment, we will do a lot of good. As I see it, of course, this theory of God has revealed himself to us, and we're therefore commissioned to go in and convert all the other cultures of the world, naturally has arisen about 2 millenniums ago when cultures were separated from each other geographically. They had no communication with one another, and it was quite natural that in those days, those regional cultures will build this up. It carries with it a certain philosophical security, faults, of course, and does carry with it some smack of the fact that we boost our own ego. God likes us, he prefers us. It's a form of salvation based on the other fellow's not being so good. A little form of gambling.
Let me ask 2 other questions then. When you are defining our more mature religion as mutual experience, I take it then that you are promoting what we might call harmony. Would that be correct? Or more and more harmony in our personal relationships?
Well, harmony with respect at least to one unifying principle, and that is the principle by which we arrive at values. Otherwise than that, we can have lots of diversification, lots of diversity within a certain degree of unity. As a matter of fact, we want a pluralistic society in hundreds of respects. There is one respect in my judgment, however, in which we need a certain degree of unity, and that is in the question of how we arrive at our values.
You are then striving to attain a higher degree of harmony among our people. Do you not sort of undermine your own process when you tell them that we must change our concept of religion? Don't we incite them a little bit and arouse disunity?
Oh, yes, I run that risk, especially with probably the way I read it.
Then just a final question, Max. Would you agree then that we are on the right track when in our legislative programs many states and many individuals are pressing for what is now popularly known as FEPC, and so forth?
Well, I think we should press in that direction.
Now we'd like to throw it open for you folks to raise your points and questions. Who would like to start? These questions are to be directed to Dr. Carmichael.
I'd like to start with this one question, assuming that I have everything straight, Dr. Carmichael. If our God is a preferential God, and if we, with our preferential God, look upon ourselves as being the chief creators of this problem, and if the only way to remove this problem is to remove the concept of the preferential God, does that not constitute the idea of forsaking one's God?
No, it involves a reconstructing of him, of course, and there will probably have to be certain elements of emotional forsaking. It's very difficult to ever reconstruct a tribal God into a world God. Our Jewish friends have been at it for a long time, of course, and even we Christians are attempting it. And there are other religions that have attempted to raise the tribal God out of the tribal relationship into a larger concept. But it's rather difficult, but it can be done, I presume. The way to do it, of course, is to start widening your own experiences with them.
I'd like to make just one other observation. It would seem to me not only difficult, but almost inconceivable. I say inconceivable because an individual's God is the greater part of an individual. An individual's God and all of his concepts of godliness constitutes the very bulwark of his sanity. When you destroy the bulwark of his sanity, by destroying his God, it would seem to me that you have practically destroyed the individual himself.
That could be true in many cases.
I think that's also referring back to the ego idea that was raised a moment ago. Who else would like to raise a question or point now?
Well, I wonder about this. If we're going to assume, and I think we should, that the person's concept of God is so tremendously strong and important, isn't it true that we ought to therefore be able to understand how important the other person's concept of God is? And isn't that something of what you're getting at? That is, are you, or let's say it this way, you're not asking everybody abandon what his concept of God is, as much as you're asking people to realize that others have equally important concepts.
Well, I'll go a bit further. I think we must, I don't use your verb abandon.
Somebody used the word forsake.
I know, but that's their word and not mine, although I was willing to accept it. There are certain people who, psychologically and emotionally, for whom it would constitute an abandonment. But in my judgment, I don't share his pessimism. I think we can take the people of the world and over the next 200,000 or 300,000 years. I'm not expecting this to go fast. We've already been at it a couple of 100,000. Take another couple of 100. But over the years to come, millenniums to come, we can see the larger orientation.
Who else now? Sure, John.
Dr. Carmichael, I think you said during the course of your talk that sometimes religious groups almost beg to be persecuted. I'd like a little clarification on it.
Well, I don't know if I should give illustrations here too much, but I think religious groups have said to their own children, oh, well, we're persecuted, that's proof that we're God's chosen. I think we can find plenty of evidence of that. I don't have any to cite and wouldn't want to cite it under the circumstances.
Other questions?
Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't want Dr. Carmichael to look upon my point of view as being pessimistic.
Well, excuse me. Excuse me. Excuse me.
Dr. Hewitt.
Obviously, with respect to this one,
Good.
Max, you spoke of a prohibition against interracial marriage, interreligious marriage, as one of the most salient expressions of this type of prejudice. Would you regard all discouraged of interracial and interreligious marriages as reflecting this conception of preference?
As long as you put the adjective all in, my answer can be readily no without any further consideration, because you're throwing me into an absolute, you see. No, not all attempts to discourage it would be considered that. I could conceive of perhaps a couple, like the couple possibly I can cite in a sample here down at a friend's church, friend's school down here. If you're in a culture where the children are going to be highly mistreated, at least you'd want the couple to consider highly what they're going to do and realize, of course, that if they make the iconoclastic break in favor of the larger ideal, they'll have to stand whatever martyrdom is going to come. As long as they realize that, then I'd have to bid them the blessings of the future. And I said the future, you see, because they aren't going to be blessed now by anybody. But only history will bless them, as we now bless some of those who lived many millenniums ago.
Dr. Howard John Toy is the administrative assistant to the president on our campus, as many of you know, and is the director of student affairs. His education was from Columbia, both master's and doctorates. He's a member of Phi Delta Kappa, Kappa Delta Pi, National Society for the Study of Education, the American Association of School Administrators. He is very pleased, and you have a right to know that he's pleased. We all please different things. That his doctoral dissertation is now being used as a textbook in courses in administration of higher education at Columbia University Teachers College. Dr. Howard John Toy will take another point of view on the solution of this problem. Dr. John Toy.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to assume that you wish to stand since you requested that previously. You have heard the chairman outline the assumptions implicit in the question we are addressing ourselves to this afternoon. I endorse those assumptions. And because I endorse the assumptions, I'm not going to spend any time with them, either in analyzing them or giving evidence to them. I do, however, wish to then address myself to the question of method rather than to the item of purposes. You also heard the chairman indicate that there were three, or that there have been at least three large areas of approach to this problem. He mentioned them in these terms: segregation, legislation, and education. We have tried segregation in many respects. I think most of us would agree another channel should now be attempted. Legislation is being attempted. There are those who believe that we can attempt to achieve equality by legislation, or I should say by mandatory legislation. I want to state that I am unutterably opposed. We cannot legislate equality, no more than you can force a man to be democratic. And why not? To establish a law does not create the fact. We have in our country established a law, particularly in our southern states, that colored folk must have separate but equal educational facilities. Do we have it? I cite you that passing a law does not create the fact. What then is civil law? Civil law receives its authority from the voluntary acquiescence of the citizenry, and not from the police power or the physical enforcement of that law. In fact, civil law can be unenforceable. Where the burden of the police powers or the burden of enforcement becomes so great as either to break the citizenry, break the community, or to force its abandonment. And we have that type of situation in the repeal of our Prohibition Amendment. Civil law receives its authority from the acquiescence or the voluntary acquiescence of the citizenry, not from police powers undergirding it. The police powers are there only to protect this majority from a recalcitrant minority. Civil law, then, is merely the legal codification of that amount of public opinion to which individuals will give their voluntary support. It is rather sort of a minimum program. We can get everybody to agree to this amount. We will make that a law. I should say that. We can make a majority of people, or we can get a majority of people to agree to this amount. We then raise that to law. The recalcitrant minority we have to take care of with police powers. But our civil law, then, is not a statement of an ideal. And we have heard the development of our colleague here base his analysis on religious and racial brotherhood. I think that we cannot base a solution to the minority problems on an ideal position. It has to be broken down into the hard-headed realities of life. Laws then are milestones as we progress in raising the majority of our citizenry toward the achievement of an ideal. That leads me into a redefinition of our problem. What is our real problem here then today? I would define it something like this. How do we affect social change? That is our problem. It's redefining it, I believe, in just another word, other series of words. Because the minority question is explosive, let's take a look at the process of social change in an area in which the explosiveness has been removed, at least a part of that explosiveness. I suggest that the public educational system in the United States would give us some clues to that. I cite you then this study by Philo Farnsworth of adaptation processes in the public school system. It was a pioneer study done around between the late 30s and early 40s in the state of Pennsylvania on the introduction of new things in education. How do changes occur in education, which is one social field? Mr. Farnsworth has isolated these various steps, which he has found in all of his studies, beginning with this one and later. These are the steps which he indicates a social change must follow. It must be initiated by a private initiative or by an individual. It cannot be mandatory and come down from above. It is then in a second stage, it is then adopted by public institutions without legal sanction. That is, the legal sanction or the legal code of that civil group does not preclude them doing it, and so the public institution may begin that practice. The third step in a social change is that the state community will pass permissive legislation, thereby enlarging the scope of institutions which may indulge or practice that new procedure. The fourth step, as he has found it, is that the state will give promotional assistance to those institutions interested in this new practice. At that stage, we begin to develop a majority of agreement about this new practice. And when that majority is reached, then we may have another milestone, another law, a mandatory law, establishing that as best practice. I would like to cite one illustration there. We have made a grand attempt, I think, in the development of international harmony with the Organization of the United Nations. Various elements there have striven for many years to obtain a Declaration of Human Rights that has been written. But they have not succeeded in developing that Declaration of Human Rights into a covenant, which is a legal instrument. And we in the United States are one country which at the present time refuses to join that covenant. We will subscribe to the Declaration, to the ideal, but we are not yet to the point where the majority will agree to that so that we can make it mandatory legislation. Now then, on the issue of minority rights, have we reached the stage of majority agreement so that we can pass mandatory legislation? That's a political question. We're not going to take it up here. How then would I suggest that we secure and maintain these equal rights? By taking these problems away from the moral level on which they're couched. It does not mean that we abandon these morals or these high ideals, but it does mean that I, as an individual, can do nothing about these big moral ideals. But I, as an individual, can do something about the concrete and specific fact of accepting my neighbor, whether he be colored, Jew, or anything else. And it's on that bedrock realism that we'll have to stand, and not, I believe, couch our program on the moral aspects of the issue, although we do not abandon the moral implications of our own acts.
Howard can keep saying if I got to stand.
Okay. Now leave that.
I was glad that you changed that word everyone into majority halfway through your speech. You took one of my questions that I was just about to pounce on you with. And what was that first sentence you used long and early that you was unalterably opposed to what? What was it you were unalterably opposed
To the attempt to achieve equality through mandatory legislation.
Didn't you later admit it as the fourth point, fourth step?
I believe that the shift in public agreement is the criterion or the focal point upon
Then you do use it finally. You are willing to use it somewhere down the line.
When the consensus is there, we do use the mandatory legislation to protect the majority from what I call a recalcitrant minority.
In your judgment, was the First Amendment to the Constitution passed too soon? You see, that's legislation. That was legal. Thomas Jefferson got that in with some difficulty. He couldn't get the Madison, you remember, tried to get the states. It's the same thing against the states. I'd like to ask you if the First Amendment to the Constitution was too early. Was it the right time in the history of the race? Was the 15th Amendment to the Constitution at the right time in the history of the race? Was the 13th Amendment? And then this covenant that we're not yet adopting in the United States. I'm not so darn sure, but we're pretty so far behind on the adopting the covenant to the Declaration of Human Rights that what death is going to stop, as I said, abroad here pretty soon. Go ahead, man.
The timing of a legal instrument, whether it be the First Amendment or the now disputed Covenant on Human Rights, is a political issue. Political issues there depend a great deal for their success upon astute political leadership. It means that the political leader at the time must gauge, to the best of his ability, the temper of his community. And if he is able then to win the majority view or the majority support, then it is not too early. But it is an astute political leader who is able to take his community in that fashion and to adjudge them in that fashion. The weakness of many political leaders is their inability to maintain contact with their community and consequently to know what their community will support and what it will not support.
I rather don't like your word political there, to be honest with you. I don't think it's so much a matter of political leadership. It is a good moral leadership and statesmanship. Do you really want to stay by your idea that there's a difference between reality and morality? You said that on the level of, you would attack the problem on the level of the reality of the moment of the individual.
I do not insist that there is a dichotomy there. In fact, I say that I will not abandon the moral implications of my act. I say that there is much the same relationship between the two as there is between theory and practice, as there is between law and the adjudication of law, or the interpretation of law.
What would you say to this challenge that, and it's been made on this campus, that administrators don't want legal measures used simply because they want to avoid an issue? College presidents and school superintendents, whatnot. That's right home to you.
Could you restate that again, please?
What would you say to the charge that this doctrine of yours, that we don't want to use legal measures too soon, is generally a way that administrators have of avoiding the issue?
I think that if we administrators are guilty of that the faculty ought to take us to task for it. But I state that as a hypothetical question, sir.
I've been there. I've been a superintendent. I've been an administrator, and by those issues arose. And by gollies, I'll tell you, it's awfully easy to use your argument as a way out of my dilemma for the moment.
To carry that out to us a little bit and not to carry it too far afield, I think Mr. Collier would vouch for the point that we wanted to avoid a rule on parking, if you'll remember, and campus registration, all the rules until we finally had to, which might be a point that will bring it back to the students here rather than just faculty and administration. Dr. John Toy has pointed out, in quite opposite to Dr. Carmichael, he points out the idea of personal difference in religion, coming closer together. Dr. John Toy brings out the idea now of adaptation of oneself to the reality, and if the adaptations do come about and a minority becomes a majority, then we can enact legislation. Questions are then ready for you to present at this time to Dr. John Toy. Mr. Roselle.
Why, I I'd like to ask this question. Dr. John Choi, you said that we cannot legislate equality. Now, I'm just wondering if you mean equality in everything or just in some things.
I'm not saying that we cannot establish in our legal codes or in our theory of jurisprudence the legal theory of equal rights. But I am saying that we cannot legislate the practice or the practices which are necessary in order to establish equal rights.
Well, a little bit later, you said that civil law receives its power from the voluntary acquiescence of the citizenry and not through the enforcement powers of the police force and so forth. And I'm just wondering if what you base your opinion on. I mean, is that an opinion or is it on facts?
I'll give it to you on opinion if you wish it there.
If you want, I would have other facts if you have it.
I would say this. Basically, I do adhere to religious tenets. At the same time, basically, I think I also established myself quite well in the pragmatic philosophy. I do not believe that you can give me any evidences of law where, let me say, law in democratic countries, because we are talking about our nation. It is an assumption here in the question. I do not believe you can give me any evidences of law that have been supported by other than the voluntary acquiescence of the community, unless you go into tyranny. And I think that tyranny is precluded from our discussion because of the assumptions of the question involved.
And to use the 19th Amendment of the Constitution as your best sample power, look how we overrode prohibition.
Yes, well, I had cited that as an example. I don't...
You see, there you
We're gonna run
make legal, and you've got plenty of evidence there, haven't you?
Well, what I'm wondering
The
about...
refusal sanction on the part of the public.
This is what came to my mind when, while I was listening. The FECC, of course, was mentioned, I think, once or twice during the talk. And we do have records and so forth that prove that the law, that equal right, as far as fair employment practices were concerned, were made, those equalities were made so because of the law and not simply because the people wanted it that way. In other words, they had been doing it one way for a long time, but after the law was passed, then we did have equality in some states.
If I might react just briefly to that, Jim, I would say something like this, that if my information is correct, I believe there are either 9 or 12 states in the Union at the present time that have fair employment practices legislation. I would then begin to say that within those states there has been developed a majority of personnel which is willing to give voluntary acquiescence to that law. And in so doing, they have developed an equality within fair employment practices within those states. Now, our large problem is that we don't have that on the federal level. And in developing what I would call the voluntary acquiescence necessary for that, we have, if it's 12 out of 48, we're still batting at a .25 average, you see. And for that reason, we're not able to establish federal legislation concerning that same activity.
Other questions?
Yes, on this point you've raised, you're looking at it from the state level, and the fear of educators, I think it applies not only to administrators, but teachers as well, to shy away from seeing this as a political issue and then ducking it and running fast. That sort of worries me sometimes. But the issue that I want to raise here, instead of looking at it, you say only 10 or 12 of them, and if I accept your definition of law, which I don't necessarily, but I think that's beyond the point. But the thing I want to raise is that from this point of view of civil rights, isn't it true that we now are worrying with a recalcitrant minority, as represented by a few senators who are having a filibuster argument in the South today? And haven't we come to a place, even if we accept your definition of law, that where the majority wants something, isn't a small handful of senators in the South, by the use of the filibuster, that can stop civil rights, can stop FEPC? So if we accept your point of view all the way along, aren't we at the point where we need to pass the law? I know that's a political opinion, I realize that.
I would agree with your analysis of FEPC and the senatorial
senatorial positions
On a national basis rather than from
on the national basis. But I would say that our approach to the problem ought perhaps not to get at the filibuster and defeat the senators on their own floor in that way, but to improve our democratic laws coming up so that the expression of the majority of those people can be accurately and fairly represented in the Senate. I would say that those persons in those states are therefore not represented by their senator. They are represented by a senator who does not represent them.
Well, but I don't know whether I quite
Maybe I'm not hitting
But
the
in the
point.
South, what I'm thinking is that small southern bloc and their senatorial representatives, and only by the use of the filibuster, which certainly is an undemocratic measure if democracy means the rule of majority, that they've been able to kill civil rights. So isn't it time for the majority? I mean, aren't we, looking from the point of view of the United States as a whole, not as a state, I'm looking at it from the nation as a whole, isn't it time that we thought about taking care of that recalcitrant minority through FEPC or legislation or Supreme Court decisions?
If we would wish to attack that, perhaps our next point would be that we have a majority, it's not a minority in the Senate that is supporting the filibuster rule. Because if we had, well, we need 3/4 there, don't we, in order to change that? Or am I in error on that? 2/3. But if we had a sufficient number of senators there who were in a majority in order to handle that, we could change the filibuster rule. Perhaps what we will have to do on that basis is to go back to the total community of the nation and begin to establish some rules of order for the Senate. But we're not in a position to do that immediately, I don't believe, under our present Constitution.
I'd like to end this now. The two gentlemen have presented all sorts of solutions for us. As your chairman, I would interpret they have ignored only one, and that is the area of economics. I don't believe I've heard that mentioned today. I think that might come into your consideration, the economic reasons for segregation, for discrimination. I would say, listening to these two gentlemen and your questions and discussions in here, that no one has talked down to anyone today. That the discussion has been extremely high, on a very fine plane, that I think each person in here has had to do some reaching for some ideas and for some words. If you like to think, and you like this type of high thinking, we urge you to return to the next meeting of the Gavel. And if you have friends who like to think with other people and think about vital issues, we urge you to invite them. This is the end, then, of this session of the Gavel, with one exception. We have coffee for you. And it will be here immediately.